Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic, let's do it. What's the most disturbing deathbed confession you've ever heard? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.
My great-grandpa came home from World War I, and his family had a great big party. He noticed his 13-year-old sister was missing, so we went and looked for her. He found their neighbor awing her. He yanked the man off of her and told her to go to their mom. We don't know if he beat him or killed him immediately, but on her deathbed, my grandma said she hid his bloody clothing buried in the front yard from that night, and the body is long gone. Where the clothing is supposedly buried, there's a beautiful patch of irises that grows. Not a confession, but a pretty funny story of my grandfather. So, I was the closest person to him in the family. I was flying home to try and see him and missed him passing by an hour. When I arrived, everyone started asking me questions. Seems he sat up in bed, turns to the others and said, "Let me tell you a story. I'm not his name. I am an assassin, and my name is Jonas McGilfrey. I've hidden $2 million in gold bullets." He then laid down and passed away. The entire family figured I had to know about it because of how close we were. I used to skip school and go to his house all the time when he got a new silent film in on VHS. I had no idea what he was talking about. Family spent a lot of time trying to figure it out. I stumbled across the answer a few years later. He was a big Louis L'Amour fan. I wasn't, but on a whim I picked up a book and started reading. Right there the book started out, "I'm not blank. My name is Jonas McGilfrey, SP, and I've hidden $2 million in gold bullets." I know it's not exactly how worded in the book, but close enough. It's been almost 30 years now. I gave the book to my mom and she shared it with the family. It's so like my grandfather to pull something like this, honestly. He was an absolute character in life. Miss him greatly, and man, I still laugh at this. My mother started confessing to killing her friend when she was a teenager. She had been senile for about a year and usually didn't talk much, but she was speaking directly and clearly. Her story was very detailed, and we were just sitting there horrified. A few hours later, she was back in a more sedated state, and someone figured out it was the plot of a book by an author she loved. I don't know how much she was aware of anything at that point. She died early the next morning, but she would have absolutely laughed her ass off if she knew what she did to us. My grandfather looked at me when I was 16 and apologized for the essay he committed against my mother when she was a child. Still with me to this day that he did that, and thought I'd be the person to forgive him. A nurse once shared that an old man confessed to sabotaging his brother's parachute during World War II because they were in love with the same woman. His brother died, and the woman married someone else anyway. He said he lived with the guilt every single day. Oof. Not really anything compared to murders and shit, and not really a confession, but the day my great-grandfather died, he asked me to retrieve a suitcase from under his bed and throw it away. It was full of porn and sex toys. He was 98, so good for him. But also, I wish I had just thrown it away. Not quite a confession, but near the end of my mom's life, she asked, "Where are my boys?" My twin and I thought she meant girls, so we told her we were there. After she died, the day before the funeral, we got a call from a PI asking if they could speak to my mom. I told them she had just passed away, and the PI shared that they represented a client looking for their biological mother. I was seriously thinking it was someone that somehow heard my mom had passed and was trying to get money. At the time, I was grieving, so it seemed that plausible. I decided to hear her out, and she was absolutely describing my mother and parts of her life that no scammer would have known. Come to find out, our mother had 2 boys from 2 different men prior to marrying our father. One of the men was from her hometown, the other was from Japan. So much of her life before our dad was an enigma suddenly. Both her sisters and Alzheimer's, so no information was ever shared with us. I don't think I'd call this a confession, but it was just before he died. I volunteered at a hospice, and there was a guy who had pretty severe dementia. Before he passed, he started reliving a moment from when he was drafted for Vietnam. He mistook me for another volunteer for his war buddies, and apparently they had murdered a man and his family when they got back. From what he was saying, it wasn't supposed to be the whole family, but things spiraled and they wound up killing the man, his wife, and her parents. He was unnervingly calm, not panicked, just calculated. He didn't acknowledge anything we were telling him either. He was stuck in that memory. He was in the middle of going over how to hide the bodies when he slipped back into his normal self and then refused to talk anymore about anything to anyone. He passed away shortly before dinner time that same day. It's nowhere near the level of what some of these are, but growing up, my mother and grandmother had always been very estranged. They had an arm's-length relationship, and the only times we visited were generally a disaster. But to her credit, my mom tried and wanted me to have a grandmother and the memories that came with it. She tried her best, but something was very off. Small details trickled out over the years, but they were vague. When it was time for my grandmother to die, I remember on her deathbed I visited. My mother did not, and my grandmother told me right before she passed, "Tell your mother I always really loved her, despite everything." That was a strange thing for her to say, because why would that have been something she needed to say? I didn't tell my mom right away because after my grandmother died, she was oddly emotionless, and I felt like it was not something my mom needed to hear just then. A few years later, the truth came out when we were talking over the phone. My mom told me that when she was 5, my grandmother tried to run her over with a car because she found out her affair partner was molesting my mother. She wanted to get rid of her. It didn't work because a neighbor saw and intervened, so my mom ended up getting sent overseas to her father's mother's home to be safe. While that got dealt with, and my grandparents got divorced. Times being what they were, however, when my mom returned, her mother got custody of her. It ended with my mother running away, being homeless, getting pregnant, very young, by a much older man, a secret sister I never knew about, and I was pretty floored. When she told me, I figured that it made a little more sense why my grandmother had said that, so I shared that with my mother finally. She said, well, she had a strange way of showing it, and that was that.
Not really reacting to any of the particular stories, but just wanted to thank the people that work with the elderly and those suffering with dementia. Extremely difficult, and whether you're a direct relative or a stranger working, just doing a job, I appreciate it, and I'm sure a lot of people do too.
I watched a video, and this super old granny in Alaska talked about how she killed her abusive husband in Tennessee or whatever. So she thought about it for months, was abused during and before that. Then she asked him to fix something up high in the barn, hid some rakes under hay, and straight up pushed the ladder and made him fall on the rakes, killing him. So she calls the police, I think it was like 1940 or 1950s time, and they investigate it and find he fell on accident. She moves to Alaska and lives a long, fulfilling, and happy life. Had an 80-year-old something patient tell me when his wife was dying, she admitted to having multiple affairs throughout their long-ass 60-year marriage. She went as far to say she never loved him, and his only son wasn't his. I was transporting him to ED, where likely only had months left to live, wanted to share with me. Still think about this often. Not really a deathbed confession, but I was working in a hospital geriatric ward, and I walked into the room of an older ill woman who immediately confided in me that she didn't have a vagina, but was married for 35 years and kept her husband very happy. That always stuck with me. I really didn't know how to respond. Maybe her intent was to get me to remember her. I used to care for people who were disabled in some way in their homes. One man I cared for was elderly, over 80 years old, and just needed help with the day-to-day things, like cooking and cleaning, driving places, etc. He was a perverted guy, and always had something to say to the ladies, some cognitive issues with impulse control being the main thing he lacked, which led to lots of inappropriate comments to women, theft from stories, and random fast walks that he and Bassett redirected back to go back to the house. One evening, we were sitting on his porch, and he asked me what the date was. After I told him, he was very emotional and sad, and shared it was the day he lost his family. I knew he had no family who visited or cared for him, and that he had been being cared for by agencies for decades. I saw the obituaries he had hanging in the house, and only one mentioned him as a survivor. It was clear the family stopped including him when he was young. He confessed that when he was a teenager, he touched his little sister. When she told, he strangled her to death. He shared details of how he buried her under a sign next to the road. He described the dress she was wearing and how Mommy was never the same and Daddy tried to kill me when they found her. I'll never know for certain if it was a false memory from a cognitive decline or if he confessed the reaction. He had no family in his life and was not mentioned in any of the obituaries of his parents and siblings, and only in the one of his grandmother. But I'll say, I believed him as he was telling me. It felt different than any others of the stories that when you were probably not true or exaggerated. He passed away a couple of weeks later. My grandma is almost 90. She had several brothers and sisters. All of them had blonde hair and blue eyes. She has brown hair and brown eyes and a slightly darker skin tone. On my great-grandma's deathbed, she said, "I need to tell you something. When I was younger, I had an affair with a Cherokee man." My grandma had already pieced this together long ago. She always told me that she was half Cherokee. Anyways, a couple of years ago, my dad did this genealogy kit from Ancestors.com. 0% Native American. I was told not to tell my grandma. My gran was on her deathbed and was convinced she was going to hell because she stole money from the church rectory 50 years earlier to help feed her 10 young children. I think Gran saying that was more upsetting to my aunts than her actual death. Not because of the stealing, because we all agree that a decent God wouldn't care when someone stole to feed children, but alas, and just how adamant Gran was that she was going to hell because of it. Made for some drama before she passed for sure. Rest in peace, Grandma. I didn't hear it directly per se, but my great-grandfather told my grandparents on his deathbed that he had another family before even meeting my great-grandmother post-World War II. But his wife and children died in a Nazi concentration camp, and he was the only one to make it out of there alive. We don't know about any other details than that. I didn't get to know my great-grandpa, sadly, but I still think about that, him and what he lived through sometimes. My maternal grandfather apparently confessed that he saw the ghost of his daughter, who had died a few years prior, the day before he had a major heart attack that took his life. It came to light that he had SA'd her as a child, and my grandmother basically knew and did nothing to protect her kids. The revelation imploded my family, but not until nearly 20 years after he died. Crazy shit. I worked as an MRI tech aide in college, and my job was simply to bring people to and from their hospital room for an MRI. One day, I was asked to get this nice, elderly, big Italian man. He was a big human, I think 6'4", 260. I would have placed him in the early 70s, and he sadly had early onset dementia. One day, I was asked to get this nice, elderly, big Italian man. We had short but nice chats on the way to and from the MRI. On the way back to his room, he told me how he was the guy called when his buddies needed to take care of business. I believe my naive response was something along the lines of, "Oh, what kind of business were your buddies in?" All kinds. But they would call him when they needed to take care of a guy. So that's when it hit me what he was saying. I chuckled to myself, attributed it to the dementia, as we got back to his room. When we got back to his room, his 3 kids and spouses, ranging from 40 to 50-ish, were all there waiting on him. You could tell they were saddened by the condition of their father, but nevertheless were kind and smiled at me as I began getting him hooked up back on his O2 and heart monitors. One of his daughters asked how he's been. The gentleman said he was feeling okay, and he had just gotten back from getting an MRI with me. It was at that moment that he said to his family very nonchalantly, "Yeah, I was just telling this young man how I used to take care of business back in the day." It was at that moment all 6 faces turned somber in unison and turned and looked at me in unison. Ah, well, yes. What a great story. Well, have a nice day, everyone, in the most cheerful voice I could muster. Never mentioned a word. Don't even remember the gentleman's name. Probably for the best. Not a deathbed confession, but when my aunt was a college student in the late 1960s, she applied for a grant to study ecology in Borneo. She delayed acceptance, her fiancé's proposal, while she waited for an answer. She waited and waited and waited. My grandmother, who was a huge fan of my aunt's fiancé, worried that the relationship wouldn't survive if she took off to Borneo for a year. She was incredibly relieved when my aunt took the radio silence as a rejection and accepted his proposal. Decades later, living a happy life with a successful husband and 3 high-achieving daughters, my aunt mentioned something about the time she wanted to study in Borneo. That was when my grandmother told her the day before the wedding an envelope came to my grandparents' house telling my aunt her grant application had been approved. Concerned she would spoil her future, my grandmother threw the envelope in the trash. When I was 10 or 11, my grandfather passed away from cirrhosis of the liver. He was a happy, functioning alcoholic. I was in his hospital room, alone with him, the day he passed. Scared because of how different he looked from the man I'd always known. He'd lost like half of his body weight and looked skeletal. He held my hand and told me that his father, my great-grandfather, killed 4 men in their beds with an ice pick because they'd arred a colored girl, and the law wouldn't do anything about it. He went into gory detail that bordered on torture P. I still have mental scars 35 years later. I didn't understand all of that at the time, and it wasn't until years later, telling my mom about it, that she confirmed and explained it was a more gentle detail. Apparently, my great-grandfather and his brother may have also been professional or maybe serial killers, and supposedly killed upwards of 25 KKK members across Alabama, Georgia, and northern Florida. Not exactly a deathbed, but near it. When I first started dating my wife, her grandmother made a speech about making sure I would treat her granddaughter right and not abuse her. She said she slipped extra Tylenol into her abusive husband's coffee, and he died of a massive heart attack. I thought she was just making up something to make me scared. At her funeral, I brought that joke up, and my wife said her grandpa died of a massive heart attack. I think she actually did it.
One weekend, a demented patient kept repeatedly telling me about someone he and his friends beat up and assaulted after the war. I assumed it would have been around early 1950s. Apparently, they took his wallet, but what struck my attention was the undertone to it and the lack of panic in his voice. Usually, dementia patients that think something is lost or stolen are very anxious. He wasn't. He just kept saying he and his buddies beat him up bad and took his wallet. And I'm 99.8% sure he was talking about a racial hate crime. The timing adds up to his details of the event were too clean. He was a respectful guy, with a good family and wife and kids. A good Midwestern family man. Something happened with him and his friends one night, and it wasn't good. There was a regret to the story, but it really just seemed like he wanted to tell someone finally. I've been a nurse for 15 years. I worked a lock dementia unit at the start of my career. I did the week-long dementia state certifications to become a trainer. I sadly know dementia well, and I interact well with them. You just go to their world and live there with them. This was different though. He kept repeating the same story all weekend, and details didn't change. That's unusual for a dementia patient. It wasn't a story or behavior he was known for telling over and over again either. I'm convinced that guy was reliving the night from 60 years ago and telling me something happened. It wasn't a dementia false reality. I'll never forget it. I still know what room he was in and everything about it. Only time I've been spooked, and I've literally had 2,000 plus patients and called 100 plus deaths. This was different. I worked with a patient with dementia for a few days in a hospital setting who was constantly rambling nonsense, but would occasionally say sexual things like, "I love your breasts." I'm male, so I assumed he was either hallucinating or reliving something from his past, or maybe I do just have exquisite breasts. One day, after we were able to get him to eat something, he went to sleep for a while, and when he woke up a few hours later, he looked me straight in the eyes and clear as day said, "I used to make love to my mother, and I can't wait to see her again." He then went back to rambling before falling back to sleep, quickly deteriorating, and he passed before the end of my shift. I always wondered if it was a truth or nonsense, but it had always stuck with me. When I was an 18-year-old CNA, I had a patient who was a very sweet elderly man. He was in our facility on hospice, as he didn't want his family to have to provide his end-of-life care. I was with him every day. I worked for over a month, and we got along extremely well. I was very close to my grandparents and great-grandma, so I get along very well with elderly people and enjoy conversations with them. This patient was a World War II vet. As he got close to death, he wanted to talk about his experiences in the war. He said he never talked to his family about them because he didn't want them to live with knowing, but he just needed to talk, and I said I didn't mind. I sat with him for a while after my shift and made him tea. He told me about how he was the pilot of one of the boats that carried soldiers to Omaha Beach on D-Day. He said it was the worst thing he ever did, knowing many of those men and boys would die, listening to them being sick and scared, and then cleaning what was left of some of them out of the boat after. He said he felt tremendous guilt about carrying them to their deaths the rest of his life. I didn't really know what to say. I just listened. I thanked him for being so brave and told him that none of those people would have wanted him to feel guilty for doing his part, and that they would be waiting to see him when he got to heaven so they could tell him so. I hope it helped.